Before we finish this case study, let's have a look at some things from the politics and the news. One of the things that's come up again recently, because it was alluded to by Josh Frydenberg in the last couple of weeks when he was talking about the budget deficits, was population and the number of children. So in 2004, the then Treasurer, Peter Costello, pictured here, famously, so shortly after the introduction of the baby bonus, which I think was introduced in 2002, Peter Costello urged Australians to have one for the father, one for the mother, and one for the country. So I'll leave you to have a look at the plot of the data and see whether you perceive any evidence there for support for a surge in 3-children families following the Treasurer's plea about 16 years ago. There's an article in the Age, and it says, one thing is for certain, despite the best wishes of the Treasurer, the era for larger family is over. Fewer people are having families with 3, 4, 5 children, says David DeVals from La Trobe. Again, I'll leave it to you to look at the data that we visualised and see whether David DeVals has been proven correct. If you're having a look at this plot, think about that, how that might be a bit deceiving in terms of answering that question, and how this plot that you generate as an exercise based on the percentage of respondents, or the proportion of respondents, might actually be a better way to answer that question. As I mentioned, this came up again quite recently because Josh Frydenberg, in his press club address, made a reference to this.
You've said that growth is key, but according to the economic update, one thing that's barely growing is the population. Overseas migration's down, the fertility rate has fallen. Given that you can't reopen the borders just yet, what incentives are you going to provide Australians to start having more babies to try and encourage the next baby boom?
Well, you are absolutely right. But that population growth effectively being halved from 1.2 down to 0.6, that takes into account both the migration levels but also the fertility rates. I think the best thing that we can do to encourage more children being born across the country is obviously to create a strong economy for them to be born into. We've provided lots of incentives for families. We've provided much increased funding for childcare, and of course we are very much supporting families across the board in terms of our policies. So I won't go as far as to say, like Peter Costello, one for the mother, one for the father, and one for the country. But what I can say is people should feel encouraged about the future, and the more children that we have across the country, together with our migration, will build our population growth, and that will be good for the economy.
There we go. Much mirth at the press club in Canberra. What I'd like to do to finish off with is just step back a bit from the specifics of the 2016 census and the typical Australian, and just consider the census in general a little bit and how representative it is. So we kind of think of it as, the data comes from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, all very official, and that, we expect it to be an accurate picture of Australia in this case. But how accurate is it? Is it really complete, the data? And can politics even make a dent in the census itself? So I've got another example here from this year, which again happens to be in the United States. So in the United States, they're running the census. Our next census won't be for another year or two, but in the US they're running one this year. And they've had a few problems with the coronavirus. And we saw that in May, the department doing the Census Bureau, said that we haven't got enough time to finish the census by the deadline. So they were asking the deadline to be pushed back so that they could finish the census. The census requires a lot of work. It isn't just everyone answers straight away. There's a lot of work knocking on doors and going to see people and the like. And they were saying that, and obviously that kind of interaction is affected by the pandemic. And so they were saying, well, we can't finish it on time and we'd like some extra time. So there's a link here if you're interested to an article from NPR, National Public Radio, which is a little bit like the ABC in the US. So a group of House Democrats introduced a bill on Wednesday that would push back those major deadlines, and it did that at the request of the Census Bureau, who said that they won't be able to deliver the census by the planned date, and which is the end of the year, and that data from the census is used to determine electoral boundaries and things. It's the same here, that the data in the census is used to determine, for example, how many seats different parts of the country have. So I think Western Australia is in fact due to lose a seat due to the fact that its population hasn't grown as fast as the eastern states. So the same in the US. And it's due to be delivered by the end of the year, which is after the US federal election. So that's when it's currently due, after the US federal election. And they're saying, rather than the end of December, can we get it in by the end of January, for example? And they're saying they've passed the point where they could meet the legislative requirement of December 31. So you might think that the Parliament would say yes, because we want an accurate census. We'll give you another month because of the extraordinary circumstances with the pandemic. We want to make sure it's accurate. We'll give you another month to complete it. What happened instead? In July, the Republicans signalled to the Census Bureau that they wouldn't allow it to take the extra time that it needs to count everybody. And then further to that, in August, early August, they said Census Bureau had to end all its counting by the 30th of September, a month sooner than previously announced. So what happened is that the bill was put by the Democrats. The Republicans controlled the Senate, and in these extraordinary circumstances with a pandemic, instead of the Parliament deciding that they could have an extra month over the mandated deadline, they decided that they were going to give them even less time in a time of a pandemic to produce the census, and that it had to be in by September the 30th, which is quite a coincidence because the election takes place in November. And so let's see if we can get that going.
Do it. But what are your concerns more broadly about where we are with this census?
We need Congress to take action. When the next COVID relief passes, we need the census to be extended to the end of October. We have to remember that the non-response follow-up period, when people come and knock on your doors, that is usually how the historically undercounted communities actually get included. That means it's absolutely necessary for communities of color. Right now, Latinos are lagging by 12%, African Americans are lagging by 14%, Native Americans are lagging by 25%. Even the Asian American population, which is doing the best of communities of color, is behind by 2%. If they cut off that period, they're not simply ending it early. They're going to then use a statistical tool called imputation to guess the race and needs of those communities. And when they guess, they tend to guess white. They tend to guess that the people who are not being included, that they look like the majority that actually performed. And that means that communities of color get erased, not simply for the census count, but that then means that racial gerrymandering would be permissible because you can't prove that they were gerrymandering communities of color. Even though everyone in the neighborhood knows it, they have no ability to prove it. So this is even more nefarious than people realize. And we need, in addition to completing the census, we need folks to call on Congress to statutorily push the date to October 31st. Do not let them end the census early. Make them do their job so we have an accurate census and an accurate count of America.
Okay, so it seems that politics has found its way into the census, and there are fears that that will affect the accuracy of the census, and in particular that it will be inaccurate in terms of representation of underrepresented groups. Stacey Abrams there refers to statistical imputation methods for filling in the gaps in the census. So let's just have a very quick look at those. So this is what they do when they don't have data that they need to sort of complete the picture. And where does that data come from? So that's where statistical imputation comes in. And there are a few different ways of doing that. Some examples, something that's called hot decking, which is a term that comes from old card stack-based computing, where the idea is that you randomly select a similar record. So let's say that you don't get a return from a household and you want to fill in data for that household. Well, you randomly select a similar record. I've got similar in quotes there because, of course, we don't have data for that household. We don't really know what is similar. So we have to make a guess or a judgment based on some other data that we have. So we might assume that that household is part of some representative group and fill it in that way. And clearly there's going to be risks there of bias and potential lack of diversity. Another way of filling in missing data is mean substitution, where if you're missing some variables, you fill it in using the mean. So for example, let's say people in the household haven't put in their age, then you might put in the mean age. Clearly that's going to risk loss of diversity, and there might be overrepresentation of people in their 30s, for example, if that's where the mean lies. Another way is probabilistically. So you look at probabilities for variables. So let's say that 20% of households have person is aged in their 30s, 10% in their 40s, 10% in their 50s, something like that. Then you fill in the missing gaps probabilistically according to that frequency range. So twice as often you'll fill in someone as being in their 30s as you will as being in their 40s, for example. Okay, so there's a risk there of reinforcing what you already know rather than discovering new things. And another way is to use predictive models, for example, based on regression, which we'll look at later in this course. Again, if you're using predictive models, you're modelling on what you've already got, and that means you're at risk of loss of diversity. So there are real concerns there. What about our census in Australia? Do we need to do the same? If we have a look at the government's website and you dig down a little bit, you can see that there is a section on derivations and imputations where they need to derive values for variables for responses to some of the questions, or impute values using a statistical process to predict values. And it gives a description here of different kinds of variables, how they've filled them in if they're missing. Imputation, for example, the primary method of imputation used is hot decking, but they also use probabilistic approaches. And they're going to talk about that. I'll leave you to have a read of that. So that's a bit of a concern. We often think of that data from the ABS as being complete and authoritative, but there are decisions being made along the way, and those decisions are being made again by people, by humans. So they're making decisions about how they're going to fill in that missing data, and so that is going to be affected by their own choices, potentially their own biases and the like. So again, it's not a perfect process, and we should always be thinking about where data comes from, how accurate it is, how representative it is.